So my podcast has four components. I don't know which one this would fall under. Um, I call it the four dimensions. So my podcast has four key things I want to offer people. So one is my anecdotes, professional and personal. The second one would be the questions, the Q&As, the questions that I answer. The third one is when I bring in guest speakers, um, which I'm currently recording sessions with specialists all over the U.S. and we're just working on editing them so that there's less downtime and there's just more high quality content. And then the fourth, dimension, so to speak, is just reactions. Um, this is more of a rant, so I don't know if this would be its own category or if it would fall under just anecdotes. But uh, this rant is just me sharing a horror story with a startup or a small company. I shouldn't say startup. A small company that I engaged with some time ago. I keep notes on my engagements. I keep notes on my contracts, and I document everything. I mean, I document my impressions of the client. I document how our communications are, what their needs are, what impressions I have. I mean, how am I feeling leading up to the contract, and likewise, for the duration of the contract, how are my interactions? Do I have the resources to succeed? Are they doing what they need to do? Am I doing what I need to do? Am I noticing any deficiency in myself that I'm failing in some regard? Are they meeting all the necessary requirements, expectations that I have of my clients, just as they have expectations of me? So I came across some horror story that I say horror story. It's just a negative experience that I had. But I documented it. I documented it so that I would remind myself in the future that if they ever came back to me, I would decline doing business with them, and I probably would not send them even to my worst enemy. So with that said, there's going to be a couple of these, but I'll make sure that each video I upload just has one story. So this one had to do with sort of an agile transformation for a company. So I was brought into a Series D startup with tons of traction, strong customer base. It was starting to become a household name and looking to IPO. So this journal entry is from January 21st, 2022 at 5:05 p.m. That's a very specific time because I actually have it right here. But that just shows me the last time I edited this or opened it. So I don't actually know I don't actually remember the client this is from because I don't keep any specifics. I don't write down anything confidential. I don't write down names. So I frankly could not even tell you, even if I was in court, I don't even know if I could name the company because I don't remember much about them. These small facts that really can't identify them is what I write. So I'm working with a Series D startup. A Series D startup is a startup that's had a couple of rounds of funding. And tons of traction means that they're making some moves. Strong customer base means revenue. And looking to IPO, that's huge. I mean, that they're looking to go public. They're looking to go, they might want to end up in the stock market. So the startup has multiple offices working independently across different cities in the US with different standards. So the startup has multiple offices in different cities that are all working independently. They were looking, and they all have different standards. They were looking to consolidate into two centralized offices, along with reorganizational efforts with the plan to create a central PMO, and house with that PMO. They want to house it along with development, business operations, and have all that stuff in New York City, and then have HR, customer support, marketing, etc. in Redwood City. So I was brought in to leverage my startup experience, lead the PMO efforts, and deliver some current state analyses with pain points worth noting to stakeholders. So I did my analysis, I did my audit, I submitted my report to stakeholders, and then I was called in to discuss my findings. And I thought I was being called in to maybe start working on what I had advised them. Instead, they told me that I needed to make corrections. And when I asked them what corrections, they said you need to correct everything. And I don't know what that means. So I made some notes about what my report said. I wrote that we didn't have any standard operating procedures. We had some, but we didn't have we didn't have the ones that we needed. There was a gap there. We didn't have any training manuals, or the ones we had were outdated. We needed a SharePoint site for new hires to get information and documentation necessary to hit the ground running. So we needed some sort of SharePoint setup so that we could automate and streamline our onboarding process. We needed to bring in some automation for testing. We needed to educate everyone on what Agile is, because I saw some pretty bad interactions. And now as I read it, it's coming back to me. I remember seeing teams on morning stand-ups just getting at each other's throats, getting frustrated with each other. I saw stand-ups that were like 2 hours long. I saw stand-ups that turned into unrelated meetings. There was no regard for the time box, no regard for just sticking to the agenda, sticking to the stand-up. People had an issue with the stand-up. Like if there was an impediment or a blocker, they would address it then and there, right? That's not Scrum. That's not Agile. That's not how it's supposed to be. There were some conflicts that didn't seem healthy. I saw that the organization had a lot of inhibited communication and silos. And I even made some notes to myself that there's no need to go on. We could, but we don't have to. So I asked them what exactly do you mean by corrections? And I stood by my observations, and then after some back and forth, I decided to go into my experiences, to further elaborate and add context to my findings and my recommendations. So during my current state analysis, I shadowed meetings, interviewed development and business analysts, team leads, managers, and stakeholders, trying to get a detailed snapshot of the enterprise from the top down, from the high levels to the granular. What I discovered was a massive disconnect from C-level. C-level people thought that things were going well, while developers, project managers, scrum masters, business analysts, people in QA, people in operations, people in HR were putting out fires every 15 minutes. That's an exaggeration, but the idea was that C-level thought that things are running smoothly, and the reality is when you talk to the individual contributors, the boots on the ground, so to speak, they were like, yeah, no, it's a mess down here. I mean, we don't know what's happening up there. We don't know what they want from us, and they're not telling us. They're just giving vague suggestions or just instructions that aren't meaningful. They're not intuitive, and we're struggling down here trying to decipher. And as we talk to each other, trying to understand, conflicts are just arising. Right? We're fighting with each other because the people in the C-suite are not communicating properly. So we have to translate for ourselves, and none of us has a Rosetta Stone. We cannot, we don't know how to understand what they're trying to tell us. So one experience that I took note here, and these notes are very haphazard. You'll see me reading here, and then you'll see me sort of not really quoting because I have to fill in some of the blanks. I mentioned here having like a negative experience while shadowing a team. I was an observer. I was observing the team, so I was an external resource. I was observing the team, and they asked me to speak at the stand-up. Like they asked me to talk about what I'm doing today, what I did yesterday. Do I have any blockers? They asked me to basically participate. I thought that was inappropriate because it would slow down my investigation. I appreciated the exposure, the opportunity for exposure, but I found it weird that they were telling me to participate in the stand-up. The team lead was insecure and would tell me that Scrum is not product owner, Scrum master, and developer, but actually product owner, Scrum master, team lead, and developer. When we had our first story point meeting, she was kind enough to educate me on this, which I appreciated. It made my report a little bit more meaty, but then things got aggressive after. So I'm a little bit sarcastic here. When I say it made my findings a little bit more meaty, what I mean is that I had more things to say, which means that, things were not great. But yeah, she did get aggressive with me. And now I'm remembering, as I read this, I'm remembering my experience and my time. So this team lead was aggressive in the morning stand-up. She would constantly challenge developers to justify why they gave a user story a certain amount of points. So, for example, there was one meeting where she asked someone who had pointed something 8 points to step forward and explain why it wasn't 5. And then she announced that as a team lead, she had the power to set the limit on points and stated that 8 was the maximum points a user story or feature could have. And as such, nothing could ever be an 8 because that's impossible. So I tried correcting her, only to be educated that as a team lead developer, Scrum best practices dictate that she challenge incorrect pointing and set the limits. I think she quoted something that kind of made sense. I'm just going off old notes, but I do remember she was saying it was within her power to set a limit, and I was just like, I don't think so. She yelled at the product owner when the product owner mentioned that other teams. That product owner was also working with other Scrum teams, and she mentioned that they don't have limits. And I didn't like that the team lead is yelling at the product owner. That's inappropriate. I would have gotten involved with her behavior, but my bigger responsibilities were to investigate the teams, and she was providing a gold mine of behaviors that needed to be addressed. Cultural changes that needed to be curbed. So I would shadow this team. Their morning stand-ups would be from 10 a.m. to noon, which is, if anyone here knows Agile and Scrum, that's a big no-no. This is just one misguided team lead, but it was definitely a team that I observed very closely. I had another team which was the opposite issue. So the developers actually had sort of collaborated to overpoint everything deliberately. So I would see user stories that were 13, 21, or 34, and I knew what was happening, and I made some observations that it's not about the developers being dishonest by overpointing, but what culture is being bred here that they feel like they have to lie, or they feel like they have to be deceptive. Because I did not get the impression that they enjoyed being deceptive. I got the impression that these developers were overpointing their user stories because they were scared. I think they wanted to make it look like they had more velocity, they had more value to the enterprise. So when there's more user stories, it makes it look like the work you're doing is more difficult, more specialized. So that's frustrating. I don't think someone should be in an environment where they feel like they have to lie or boast, boost their numbers, boast about their value to the enterprise. Like that shouldn't be necessary. Another team had a stakeholder filling in. So someone from the C-level was filling in as a Scrum Master when the Scrum Master left. I thought that was a problem. Another team had a Scrum Master who was also a developer. That's hardly a sin. I wouldn't say that was crippling behavior, but at the same time, the Scrum Master and developer, that's supposed to be separate roles. One team had a very attentive product owner who would constantly criticize the developers for how slow they were working. This product owner had a programming background, so it was a former developer turned product owner, and thought it was appropriate to constantly give the developer suggestions on how to tackle certain tickets. So basically give guidelines or give orders really on how to approach problems. These developers were getting a little touchy about the constant suggestions from someone who wasn't involved in development, and they made a joke about how the product owner had traded in their keyboard for a clipboard, which I found amusing. I'm glad I noted that down. When it came to communication, I would see developers asking team leads to talk to a manager in the business line, to talk to a business analyst, to maybe work on something if it was okay. So there was a lack of confidence. There was a void of declarative language when developers were talking to non-developers, and there was such a roundabout fashion for communication. Things moved slowly. Testing was a mess. One QA engineer for every 10 developers. Developers refused to use tools or set up quality gates or test software with something like SonarQube before sending it to QA for more thorough testing. So developers were not doing their part in having some ownership over quality assurance and testing. We didn't have SOPs for software engineers and code review. We had some SOPs that were old, and they referenced other SOPs that did not exist, which was weird. And that I remember thinking that was kind of funny. When we hired, not we, but when this company hired new employees, they would send them to a dozen different people for training. So, for example, what they would do is they would hire someone from HR, and that person would, to get a well-rounded education, they would spend a day shadowing someone in HR, then spend a day shadowing people from logistics, then spend a day shadowing people in accounting, and they would just rotate throughout these different departments. And that means HR would eventually, shadow a developer for a day, which slows down that developer's workflow. And then more importantly, you have developers who part of their onboarding process is rotating through other unrelated departments, which is a mess. I mean, that's not a best practice, and that's not very helpful. So, I even took specifics here. There was a talent acquisition specialist who shadowed a developer and was upset. There was a developer who was upset for shadowing contract specialist. Marketing was shadowing QA. It was a mess. And I was looking for ways for how we can digitize everything, maybe get some training manuals in there, and focus on training manuals for each department. I suggested a one-stop shop SharePoint. That idea was shot down. They had a lot of paperwork for new hires. They had all these like welcoming orientation, packets that were just a waste of paper, bad for the environment, and quite frankly, they weren't of value to anyone. They would be outdated they would get outdated very quickly. So it was a waste. I had a lot of recommendations that were ignored. I had a lot of findings that were just buried. And overall, this was a horror story. Like, this is an example I speak about, and I tell people that there are times when I've been unhappy. There are times when I've been disappointed because I like adding value. I like helping enterprises reach their best self. I like to be an agent of change. And when I go somewhere and I don't leave it in a better state than when I leave, that frustrates me. It frustrates me because my efforts have been in vain. My time has been wasted. Obviously, you're compensated, so it's not that like you did it for free and you're even more frustrated. But at the same time, even if you're compensated, I mean, if you work on something and then you just see that what you worked on is just trashed, like almost immediately, it's just dismissed or seen as not valuable. That doesn't really give you a feel good feeling inside. So that was just a horror story that I thought was worth mentioning because I come in to accomplish X, Y, and Z, and I leave having accomplished none of them. Right. The whole alphabet was assigned to me. I'm A through Z. They wanted 20 plus different things done. And while I did my best to try to improve their posture, their way of working, how they approach their people, how they approach their projects, how they, approach training, ultimately I failed in that regard. And this is actually a failure that I speak about sometime in interviews when they ask about, tell us about a professional failure that kind of stings. This was actually, a frustrating example. And I actually took a note here. There's a little addendum. The company ended up making me laugh. After rejecting weeks of hard work, they asked me to leave my company full-time in a capacity unrelated to the work that they offered me. They offered me a full-time job, helping them stand up their PMO offices. And I said, look, respectfully, I was apparently grossly underqualified based on my report. And I said, I don't know why you would invite me to lead your policy-making team, writing white papers, and essentially twiddling my thumbs. So I declined a little bit politely, but the CEO asked me to reconsider and pinged me a few times. After dismissing my findings, he would approach me a few weeks later and say, hey, actually, could you quit your job, come work for us full-time, and we'll absolutely, totally listen to you. But when I looked at the opportunity, I was like, it looks like you guys just want to pretend you have someone who knows what they're doing managing your PMO. But in reality, I think my hands would be tied. When I say twiddling my thumbs, what I mean is I wouldn't actually be allowed to execute. I wouldn't have any authority. I wouldn't have any power. I would not be able to actually act with latitude and add value the way that I would want to. And that's that. That is the end of this horror story. Hopefully this is a cautionary tale to anyone who thinks about getting involved in startups. This is some of the things you have to deal with.